Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to contribute to your discussion about 6 years after the UN Guiding Principles. And it's good to contribute from the OECD because the OECD Guidelines were also revised 6 years ago. At the same time as when the UN Guiding Principles came into life. And it's good to remind everybody that the revision of the OECD Guidelines embedded the UN Guiding Principles in its human rights chapter. And was that important? I think it was. When you look at the success of the UN Guiding Principles, it is also a success of the OECD Guidelines, and all the successes of the OECD Guidelines were also a success of the UN Guiding Principles. And why? Because in 2011 the OECD did two things. First of all, we made the OECD Guidelines human rights chapter, which is the UN Guiding Principles, a binding legal commitment for governments. So we increased the legal value of the UN Guiding Principles. Second of all, we added to the UN Guiding Principles a unique global grievance mechanism which doesn't exist somewhere else. So these two elements in 2011 were quite crucial to boost the UN Guiding Principles. Was this a success 6 years after? I will talk about this a little bit more, but first let me show you how this can work. A very recent complaint we dealt with in the Dutch national contact point for the OECD Guidelines regarded Heineken. 168 former employees of Bralima, a subsidiary of the beer brewer, they made a complaint to the national contact point about human rights and workers' rights in the time when there was a civil war. They alleged that Bralima unfairly dismissed these workers, also by working together with the rebels. The good news is that this case has been recently handled successfully. There was a mediated agreement and all the parties were quite satisfied with it. There was compensation for the workers, which is pretty rare, and this was mentioned as a historic agreement by civil society. Why is this historic? And I agree with that. It's an historic agreement. First of all, compensation. It's pretty rare. There are many remedies out there, but compensation is pretty rare. And it also shows that cases that can go back 15 years, that are extremely complex, can be dealt with successfully by the national contact point system. And third of all, it shows that it can also deal with very complex, remote areas and have still accessible access to remedy for victims of human rights and workers' rights violations. So this is a case which shows how it can be done. Of course, there are many more. Last year we had the FIFA case, which led to a mediated agreement with the union and FIFA. Now there will be inspections, including the trade unions, for the Qatar World Cup stadium building, etc. There have been compensation for the Sami people in the north of Sweden and Norway. I can go on like this, but these are just illustrations of how it works. Just to remind everybody, what is the system of the OECD Guidelines? First of all, it's a comprehensive multilateral agreement on business and human rights. Of course, it also includes environment, labor, corruption, etc. But it's a multilateral agreement on business and human rights. On corporate responsibility, this is the Paris Agreement for corporate responsibility, like the other Paris Agreement on climate change. But this is the most serious international agreement regarding corporate responsibility. It's binding for governments. That's quite unique because the governments have a binding obligation to do this under international law. It's not binding for business. However, it has very strong implications because it's seen as morally binding, not legally binding. And it is a globally active grievance mechanism. So they have extraterritorial applications. So that's why, for example, a UK national contact point can deal with a case in India, which is not an OECD member, can deal with cases in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in all kinds of countries that are not OECD members. So extraterritoriality is a unique selling point of this system too. So what do we normally do? We first, after a complaint comes in, we filter the real and substantiated cases. If that's done, then we offer mediation. It can also be conciliation. And the golden route is that it works. Then we find a mediated agreement. If it doesn't work, we provide authoritative recommendations to the company or sometimes to the complainant. And the good thing now is, and many people still don't know that, is that more and more teeth are in this system. So there are consequences to this system. If mediation fails and a recommendation comes out, these recommendations have to be taken into account by the export credit agencies in the OECD. That's in their Bible for the export credit agencies, that they have to take that into account. And more other links to economic diplomacy instruments are made. For example, in Canada, if a company refuses to participate in a complaint handling at the NCP, they will lose all their enhanced economic diplomacy support. So no trade missions, etc., no subsidies. So that's very important. The teeth are definitely much bigger than 6 years ago. So that's a major innovation too. And then the big question is, how much did this deliver? If you look 6 years ago, you can see that now about 50% of all the cases that come in are about human rights. So it has been established as a serious human rights grievance mechanism. And then the results, depending on the year, about 50 or even more than 50% of all the cases that we accept as a system lead to a mediated agreement. That's a pretty high track record. Of course, that's not everybody is happy, because there are still cases where there's no mediated agreement, but still more than 50% mediated agreements. That's pretty good. And if there's no mediated agreement, there will be authoritative recommendations that are more and more taken very seriously, even by institutional investors. So what kind of remedies are given? What kind of mediated agreements are found? For example, trying to eradicate child labor, blocking mining in gorilla parks in Congo. We have seen issues related to health and safety in the fashion industry, for example, and more. So there's a wide range of remedies being given. Let me be quite clear. Remedy is not the same as compensation, and remedy does not always have to look back. Sometimes even an apology or a change of policy can be seen as a remedy. So does this all look good? Is this all a pretty picture? No, because there's still a lot of work to do. What is very disappointing is that about 14 of all the 48 member states of the Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct and of the NCP system are not fully functioning. So there's still a lot of work to do. And we need civil society to put pressure on the governments to remind them of their binding legal obligations. So we need you to remind them. Of course, we are doing our bit ourselves. We have peer pressure. There was a major breakthrough last ministerial council meeting where all the ministers decided that they will do a peer review of all the 48 national contact points before 2021. That's a major process, and for civil society it's very useful because these national contact point peer reviews are a huge opportunity for civil society to beef up their NCPs. So all in all, how does it look? The glass is, I would say, half full, but it's not full yet. It needs to be full, and there's a lot of work to do, but the progress is quite good. If you look back 6 years ago and look at the NCP system at that time, and you look at it now, it's dramatically improved. You won't recognize this if you look back 6 years ago. So major progress, and to a large extent that has been made possible by the momentum generated by the UN guiding principles. So the fact that the OECD guidelines and the national contact points and the UN guiding principles are married shows that and indicates that we have to keep on working together and we reinforce each other's work. I hope this was a useful update. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to come to your meeting myself in person, but I hope to talk to you later, and don't hesitate to contact me for further questions. Thank you very much.